Harvard Divinity School.
A Decolonial Lens on Psychedelic Ethics, December 10th, 2024.
Well, welcome everyone. This is our final psychedelics event of the fall 2024 semester. I'm thrilled that you're all here, both in person and on Zoom. My name is Jeffrey Bro, and I am one of the program leads at the Center for the Psychedelics and Spirituality programming. This is part of our Psychedelics and Ethics series, which is now in its second year and represents an important node in the larger psychedelics and spirituality research happening at the Center for the Study of World Religions. The Psychedelics and Spirituality program is itself also embedded in the Center's ongoing and evolving initiative called Transcendence and Transformation, or TNT for short. If you're interested in the psychedelics programming, the TNT initiative, or any of the other research happening here at the Center, we will put a link to the Center's homepage and the newsletter in the chat function of the Zoom. So please sign up for that. It can also be found on the CSWR's site, or if you're here in person, we will direct you to that afterwards. I do want to make one really quick programming note before we get started on today's program, which is that registration for our third annual Psychedelic Intersections Conference is now up on the website. That conference will be on February 15th of next year, and there is registration available both in person and virtually. Attendance is free, but we do have a relatively limited number of spots for in-person attendance. So if you're interested in joining us in person, please register as soon as you can. For today's conversation, Paul and I are thrilled to be showcasing work from the semester-long Decolonial Lens on Psychedelic Ethics workshop, which was organized by visiting scholar Christine Hauskeller. Joining Dr. Hauskeller today Joining Dr. Hauskeller on today's panel is an interdisciplinary group of students and scholars who have attended the workshop over the semester and who will be sharing insights from their critical study of decolonization practices in psychedelic studies. To give a quick sense of how today's conversation will unfold, in a moment I will turn the floor over to my friend and colleague Paul, who will introduce himself and Dr. Hauskeller. Dr. Hauskeller will then provide an overview of the workshop and the decolonial approach that it took. We will then pass the mic down this long line, allowing each of the scholars and students here to introduce themselves and then present on their work and how the decolonization workshop has changed their approach to psychedelic studies. Once that portion of the event has concluded, we will have ample time for a moderated discussion and audience Q&A. For those of you in person, just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And for those of you on Zoom, I will be doing my best to keep an eye on my computer down here on the floor. So please ask your questions through the Zoom Q&A at any point. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass things over to Paul to introduce himself and Christine Hauskeller.
Hello, yes. Oh, hi, I'm Paul. So Christine Hauskeller is a professor of philosophy at the University of Exeter in the UK. She specializes in the philosophy of medicine and in moral and political philosophy, using approaches from feminist theory and the Frankfurt School. She is an expert on evidence production in clinical trials and in the study of constellations of knowledge and power, or epistemology and normativity. And after 2 decades working on the life sciences, she shifted her focus to emerging psychedelic medicine, decolonizing approaches, and animism. Christine co-founded the Exeter Transdisciplinary Research Group on Philosophy and Psychedelics, and her recent publications include Philosophy and Psychedelics, Frameworks for Exceptional Experience from Bloomsbury Academic, and a thematic issue of Interdisciplinary Science Reviews on Critical Psychedelic Studies just this past year. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you for the center for hosting me for the last 4 months and for the many students who came to the workshops. It was an interesting experience because I had sort of thought it would be like a reading group and it would be the same people over the sort of many sessions, which turned out often not to be the case. So because of maybe the way it was announced, maybe the way the themes were so different, they attracted quite different participants. And I'm very glad that some more, but especially the people who are with me on the panel today really came regularly and have made such an important contribution. So I'm glad that we can discuss the topic or introduce some of the thoughts we shared over these weeks of our course with you and see where this goes. Let me introduce the topic first. So I came here to really do this workshop series on a decolonial lens and psychedelic studies, and so I need to introduce, I think, what made me do this. So when we think about ethics and psychedelics, many questions come to mind looking at the current renaissance in using psychedelics for medical treatments in psychiatry. Among them are classical bioethics topics such as, doctor-patient relationships, questions of patient safety on many different levels. But also, I think with psychedelics, we have a very peculiar and special ethical issue. And that is that in difference to, say, maybe genetics and certainly stem cell research, which I've worked on before, psychedelics are not new. The experiences they engender come not out of Western laboratories, and the use of them for changing the way in which a community or individual people feel has been developed, the expertise how to do this, in the oppressed cultures of, in particular, the Americas, but not only. So there is sort of a history to the use of psychedelics for healing that really is transplanted or maybe taken, colonized, extracted and reappropriated, to use the decolonial language, from other cultures into the Western medical system, where it is going to be streamlined and developed into for-profit. So there is a debt and a recognition to be paid, and the question is, how can this happen? Not least because it is partly indigenous substances that are key drivers of that Western psychedelic medicine revolution. Psilocybin, for many people traveling especially to Brazil, Peru, etc., ayahuasca, but also peyote, iboga, which is becoming more used and which we will be talking about more later. So this recognition, a clinician said to me, who does clinical trials, said to me, so why would I can see what you're saying, but how would this affect me? And I said, well, when you use psilocybin in your clinical trials, you should talk about mushrooms and about the cultures that actually this came from. That would be step number one. And that brings me to the topic of our first workshop, and that was really about the clarifying the concepts and the terms and introducing the idea. With, in particular, I chose to look at the ways in which Nelson Maldonado Torres introduced 10 theses on coloniality and decoloniality, in which he tries to give us some clarity on the terms, drawing largely on the work of Frantz Fanon, but looking through the lens of the marginalized and excluded at what happens with the psychedelic renaissance gives us a very different picture than when we look through the lens of the clinicians primarily that move this forward with big donor support from particularly wealthy individuals and a few very interested pharmaceutical companies. So taking the perspective of the marginalized and excluded, that is, however, and that will tell us something about why I organized the workshop the way I did, includes indigenous peoples who have been using psychedelic substances for hundreds of years. That also includes, however, people marginalized in the West through the criminalization of psychedelics. The people who have partly using psychedelics for healing practices in the underground at risk of legal persecution, but also the communities who use psychedelics for other purposes, such as parties and fun and self-exploration, who have contributed enormously to what happens now in the clinic. not only is there an overlap in sort of people who move between those spaces from the rave into the clinic, but also there is a way in which the music that is being used, what we know about risks, what we know about safekeeping, the whole practices around that are coming from the festival and rave space more than from any other space. So the marginalized and excluded, whose knowledge is being colonized, are a broad group of people, including also religious users, of course. And to look at this field within which suddenly medicine is sort of taking the psychedelic substance and knowledge from wherever they can get it from and turning it into profitable therapies is an injustice to many groups that have, at the risk of criminal persecution and eradication and the crimes that colonization has imposed, especially, of course, on the people in the Southern Americas, been keeping and maintaining and developing this knowledge for a long time. So we tried to speak about all that, but also about the way in which it's not only groups of humans, it is also nature. There is something happening when we think about a massive rush on peyote, iboga, ayahuasca, or psilocybin, in which all this sort of desperate people in the global north who suffer from severe mental ill health and who might benefit from taking these substances, if we actually draw on the natural substances supplied, we will commit similar crimes as before, creating monocultures, destroying landscapes, and actually putting plants at risk, in particular peyote, which Osiris will say more about later. There is a way in which actually the nature we live with doesn't allow certain forms of turning psychedelics into medicines for Westerners. So there need to be other solutions thought about if we keep our relationship to nature that might be positively engendered through psychedelic experiences and turn this into a positive force in actually maintaining that nature, then we need to look at the psychedelic medicalization also as a drive in which protecting nature and the environment needs to come into view, and how this is actually feasible if the therapies were to be developed, and in which way. So we looked at the quality of the science in workshop 2. In workshop 3, we looked at a other dimension on manipulating and exploiting the participants through medicalization, and that is the ways in which there is the minds and processes of consciousness are to some degree heavily manipulated through the ways in which the clinic uses psychedelics, with its ideas of mysticism and a very Western mystical type experience that is sort of disembodied and is in an environment that is very much catered to serve the needs of clinical trials rather than the needs of the research trial participants. So there is reports of manipulation, of exploitation, and this needs to be kept in mind that if there is a benefit from psychedelics as a therapy, then it is always a highly individual benefit, not only because the trip experience is very individual, but also because nobody is actually promoting that psychedelics without psychotherapy and ways in which we make sense of what happens during the psychedelic experience is become part of how one reconceptualizes one's life. So we then looked at learning from nature and the environment and the perspectives and the expertise of the marginalized that is being gobbled up, washed and reused in the medical pharmaceutical apparatus. This brings me to the end of my short introduction, because the other members on this panel will actually give much more flesh to the points I've just been highlighting here, but I want to bring to attention one particular article that I find really important as guiding us or giving us some ethical principles with which to look at the psychedelic renaissance, if we want to use that term, and the colonizing practices that happen within it that we want to avoid for ethical reasons. And that is a paper by Seligman and colleagues, in which they put out ethical principles of indigenous medicines used in Western psychedelic research and practice. They give us 4 main categories that need to be engendered and woven into the way in which Westerners use psychedelics. They are very broad terms, really: acknowledgement, knowledge translation and education, intellectual property and belonging. These are the characteristics that they point out the Westerners need to respect and consider when designing psychedelics as something to be used within the Western context, taken from indigenous practice. And then they develop not the 3 R's we know from animal research, but actually the 8 R's that means we should use. And the 8 R's really give us some guidance into how can we think about practice. There is reverence and respect for the knowledge that is out there, as I've tried to indicate. Then questions of responsibility and relevance. Where is what in the psychedelic field relevant? There is a way in which too many ghosts from the past still are structuring the public perception and the regulatory discourses on psychedelics. But also, how can regulation work when we think about intellectual property, and reparations work when we think about intellectual property and appropriation? And then what does restoration mean and reconciliation mean when something that belongs into one set of cultures and practices and landscapes and nature in this world is actually going to be taken and moved and spread into others? So what would restoration and reconciliation mean? These 8 R's, I think, are quite helpful as a guide to think about ethics in this decolonial ethics and psychedelics. And that brings me to Lorien, who will talk more about the ways in which we look after people in different spaces. Please introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, good evening. My name is Lorien Cibulo, and I'll be talking about the influence of these colonial forces onto psychedelic therapy as it's going through the regulatory processes of pharmaceutical regulatory processes. So I come to this as the former program manager for the Psychedelics Research Center at MGH, and as well from some farmer roles that gave me a firsthand experience with these regulatory processes. And so if we look at the moment where psychedelic assisted therapy really became kind of hailed as this like revolution, or it was going to be a paradigm shift in psychiatric care, right? In this, if I translate what some of the aspects of traditional use into the language that we would use for our medical system, the things that patients and physicians as well were excited about were aspects such as the fact that we would have a transdiagnostic approach with this sort of therapy, that there would be a very active patient involvement in their own healing journey in a way that we haven't really seen in psychiatry since the advent of psychopharmacology in the 50s. And this integrative process that Christine talked about, right? This whole work that happens after the actual moment with the medicine, right? Which we don't really have an equivalent for in other drugs that we approve through the FDA that we prescribe to patients. And then over the past 20 years, we've really seen this, psychedelic assisted therapy being really contorted to fit through this regulatory system. And that's because this regulatory system isn't really built to accept the sort of dimensions that we were interested in with psychedelic assisted therapy. We require a single indication, right? It's MDMA assisted therapy for treatment resistant PTSD. If you want to study depression, you have to do another study, because otherwise that's called off-label use. So we don't really have a space in our regulatory system for transdiagnostic tools. And then all of this, you've surely heard that one of the largest problems with psychedelic-assisted therapy was that we couldn't find an appropriate placebo, or there were questions of unblinding during the therapy process. And of course, the gold standard that we have for the FDA today is a placebo-controlled, randomized, double-blind clinical trial. As well as the difficulty with the therapy part, and that's made evident in the refusal of the FDA for MDMA-assisted therapy in August. It was this whole question of we just don't know what to do with the therapy bit of it. The FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine, so for them it's what does the chemical agent do, and how are we supposed to advise on the therapy part, which obviously in psychedelics, or in the way in which psychedelics are interesting in this paradigm shift, is crucial, right? So in the end, what it looks like is what we're trying to approve is what we've always done, right? It's some sort of deuterated or a version of a molecule or an enantiomer, right? Something that's patentable. Unlike a psychedelic that's been around for a while, and that you give to somebody they don't really have a subjective experience because it's weird to, have this whole trip thing, and then you don't have to compose with the burdensome and costly therapy aspect. So that's what we've always done in the past, right? So the optimistic view on this is that really the paradigm shift that a lot of people are interested in here doesn't actually have to do with legalizing psychedelics in medicine, but rather when we have a practice that has all of these extra dimensions that we're interested in and we're putting it through our regulatory process, those friction points, they are very much the points at which that transformation of the system should be worked on, and these friction points give us an indication of where these shifts need to happen for us to then move towards a system that would truly be a paradigm shift. And that's going to take a lot more than just approving psychedelics.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm Jeffrey, another Jeffrey here. I'm Jeffrey. I am a second year Master of Divinity student here at Harvard Divinity School. So I will discuss how today's medical and therapeutic interest in psychedelics appears to follow the same pattern, the same trajectory we previously observed in the shift of the traditional meditation to medicalized or commodified mindfulness. In doing so, I aim to highlight the patterns that risk hollowing these practices, reducing them to mere tool and commodities, rather than honoring their rich spiritual and cultural context. For centuries, meditation has held a very central place across spiritual traditions, like Buddhist traditions, not simply as a relaxation technique, but as a profound spiritual practice embedded in a rich cosmology, situated within a moral framework and aimed at the cessation of existential suffering. Yet, in the very popular Western adaptation, Buddhist meditation has often been stripped from its religious and cultural context, rebranded as mindfulness, a seemingly neutral, secular tool for therapeutic use, stress reduction, productivity enhancement, and overall wellness. So what was once a cornerstone of spiritual development, intimately intertwined with a large ethical framework and sociological goals, has been largely recast as a self-contained wellness product, divorced from the very rich tapestry that originally gave it meaning. This process can be accurately understood through three interrelated concepts: deracination, secularization, and instrumentalization. Deracination is the first step. It involves extracting a practice from its original cultural, historical, and religious context, thereby severing its root from the very traditions that once informed its meaning and purpose. The second step is secularization. It removes or dilutes the spiritual and religious dimensions, reframing the practice as a rational, neutral, evidence-based technique that can be readily assimilated into institutional and social settings. Then, instrumentalization emerges as a natural outcome of these earlier steps, shifting the emphasis from the intrinsic value and richer experiential dimensions of the practice toward a measurable effect and commodifiable product. In other words, rather than valuing an activity for its inherent moral, spiritual, or existential significance, instrumentalization construes its worth solely in terms of practical outcomes, such as reduced stress, enhanced productivity, or improved mental health. And this reinforces a utilitarian, market-driven logic. I can see that a similar pattern is now observable in the re-emerging interest in psychedelics. Historically, for indigenous communities, plant medicines are part and parcel of the relational networks that include the local flora, the land, the community itself, and also the cosmos. Taking these substances extend far beyond the biochemical intervention or system relief. Instead, it is embedded within a complex cultural matrix that includes ancestral knowledge, spiritual guidance, ceremonial protocols, communal participation, and ethical norms. Psychedelics foster profound connection among individuals, their communities, and the more than human world. In other words, the significance of these plant medicine derived not only from their neurochemical effects, but from their integral place within broader systems of meaning, moral orientation, and collective identity, whether it is human or non-human. However, these substances are now frequently framed and standardized as compounds, as therapies, suitable for controlled clinical trials, strictly regulated protocols, and scalable modes of delivery. So under this paradigm, the emphasis rests primarily on measurable outcomes, such as, just as I mentioned, relief from trauma, depression, mitigation of addiction, and reduction of social anxiety, rather than on the deeper cultural and relational significance. So in this sense, we witness a process of instrumentalization that is very similar to what has been experienced in meditation as it transforms into mindfulness. Psychedelics, again, risk being reduced to mere tools for treating Western mental health issues. And then we risk marginalizing, misrepresenting, and even neglecting the community and institutions that have long stewarded their integrative and holistic use. This medicalization of psychedelics is frequently positioned as addressing what some may refer to solve the issues of Western modernity. In other words, as these substances are instrumentalized, presented as discrete interventions to mental health issues, they are cast as quick fixes for problems that are, at least in part, structural, systemic, and deeply embedded in neoliberal socio-economic arrangements. Rather than prompting the critical reflection on the underlying causes of suffering, such as social isolation, economic inequity, this approach often reduces complex cultural issues to mere biochemical imbalances. In doing so, it deflects the attention away from the deeper political, economic, and ethical dynamics at play, reinforcing a narrative that the remedy for this existential discontent lies in the commodified therapeutic interventions rather than in the fundamental social or cultural transformation. In doing so, we also commit a form of cultural violence. We take from indigenous peoples and other spiritual communities or custodians one of their most precious resources, stripped it of its integrative context and refashion it to serve the individualistic goals. This could be cultural appropriation at a systemic level, appropriating not just the objects, but entire cosmologies or epistemologies of the indigenous people, and then repackaging them as tools to fix the problems largely created by our own cultural systems. Indigenous ways of knowing, which are often granted in centuries of relational experience with the land, with non-human entities, and the spiritual dimensions of existence, are then marginalized and or dismissed as noises within the dominant biomedical and rationalist framework. In this process, the mystical and existential experiences that these traditions engage, experiences that challenge the boundaries of conventional Western scientific paradigm, are often reduced to neurochemical correlates or deemed inexplicable anomalies, unworthy of serious inquiry. Lacking a suitable conceptual apparatus to engage with these phenomena that transcend measurable outcomes and linear causalities, Western frameworks tend to ignore, pathologize, or trivialize the epistemic contributions of indigenous knowledge systems. Consequently, the complexity, references, and communal meaning-making integral to these practices are lost, replaced by a flattened narrative that prizes individual symptom relief over collective, cosmologically embedded understanding of health, healing, and spirituality.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was amen to that. I'm Ashwin Budden. It's wonderful to be with you all tonight, and my colleagues on this panel. I'm a research fellow in bioethics at Harvard Medical School. Work on ethics and regulatory issues in biodiversity and biogenetic prospecting and therapeutic innovation. So I think psychedelics kind of fits within that box as well. I'm also a medical anthropologist by training, and I work as a global health advisor on health policy and programs in public health programs in particularly in development settings. And I've also conducted ethnographic research on mental health care seeking and traditional Afro and Indigenous spirituality and healing in Brazil, which also includes some work with some ayahuasca communities there. For me, the participation in these workshops, I think, have really been a way to take a broader critical view of the psychedelic space, and in many ways echoing what we've heard thus far. I kind of think of it in a nutshell as looking at the social life of psychedelics beyond the kind of biomedical, biologized view of psychedelics, as we've heard. What I'm going to do is talk about a kind of a real-world example that kind of anchors into some of these concepts, and maybe just to highlight for me what has been sort of important principles within the workshop series. First has been, again, the recognition of the historical context of psychedelics, and by that I also mean the specific histories of psychedelics, not just a sort of broad history, but each substance or each kind of bioculture of psychedelics has its own history, and that links both the projects of colonialism and empire building into the current, the present with kind of capitalist regimes of intellectual property, research and innovation, and profit maximization. A second point is really around thinking about how we make reference to psychedelics in terms of globalization and cultural impact. I think, as we've heard, the concept of biopiracy is really central in terms of how natural resources, cultural resources are appropriated, transformed, and commodified within transnational value chains, often leaving aside or distorting traditional heritage, traditional knowledge. And the third point is about ethics, and this is thinking about how we reckon with the power dynamics between global north and global south, and how we choose to uphold values of equity, reciprocity, and sustainability, not just in scholarly inquiry, but also with the potential to translate them into policy action. So I want to kind of illustrate some of these points with an example of the psychedelic ibogaine, which in some senses a bit in the shadows of other kind of more prominent psychedelics. But I'm going to kind of relate some points in fact, a very complex and deep story, but maybe just some relevant points that I'll make here. So ibogaine is a psychoactive alkaloid derived from the iboga tree, which is growing only in the Congo Basin in Africa, most notably in the country of Gabon. Iboga is the central ritual sacrament in Bwiti, which is a set of spiritist traditions practiced by around 50 ethnic communities in a country of about 2 million. It's known to scientists and in public circles and even in the mass media as a powerfully effective treatment for addiction and other mental disorders such as PTSD, depression, and even for treating traumatic brain injury. Ibogaine has been studied and used for informal therapeutic and performance enhancement purposes in the global north since the French colonial conquest of equatorial Africa in the 19th century. It also has been a centerpiece of advocacy against the US war on drugs since the 1970s. One thing I also came to learn is also very prominent in the advocacy for HIV/AIDS legislation in the US. The last decade has seen an explosion of global demand for iboga and ibogaine-assisted detoxification, especially within informal clinics and wellness retreat centers. And these are centers that have sprung up around the world, particularly in countries where ibogaine is not regulated. In recent years, Euro-American biotech and pharma companies have ramped up investment in R&D on ibogaine, on synthetic analogs, on clinical trials, and efforts to acquire IP rights, intellectual property rights. Meanwhile, over in Gabon, rampant poaching, deforestation, and the like, it feeds an illegal transnational trade in iboga and threatens this vital natural biocultural resource and the traditional communities. So it's estimated that about 95% of iboga is acquired through the illegal market. The price in the last decade has increased about 800%. And iboga has actually come to be known as the blood diamond of the psychedelic world. Now, to combat biopiracy, in 2020, an NGO based in both the UK and Gabon called Blessings of the Forest established a 5-year benefit sharing program between the government of Gabon, traditional communities, spiritual communities, and iboga farmers, and a biotech company and its affiliated iboga therapy providing organization, which is the largest therapy providing organization in the world, which operates in Canada and Mexico. This agreement complies with something called the Nagoya Protocol, which is the United Nations regulatory framework for equitable benefit sharing around biogenetic resources and the protection of traditional knowledge. This is the protocol itself is far broader than psychedelics, but this agreement is the first of its kind in the world to promote reciprocity and sustainability around a psychedelic resource. And just to say, I'm actually developing a research grant proposal to do a study to look at the embedded ethics and impacts of this benefit sharing partnership and whether it could be used as a model for global policy and adapted to other psychedelic biocultures. So I'll stop here, but I hope this kind of gives a kind of an example or a brief story of how some of these concepts we have been relating to kind of anchor into a particular history of a psychedelic called ibogaine.
Hello, everyone. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit. I took notes on my computer, so let me figure out how to do this comfortably. And I'll give a contextualized intro in just a second. As Christine talked about, there are various groups and peoples that steward rich knowledges of psychedelic usage that have something at stake in this current moment. And these peoples and groups have wisdom and agency that might be disregarded, stolen, or leveraged to arguably unethical ends. And from among those, I want to highlight what we broadly identify as the underground, which includes ravers, burners, sex workers, unlicensed facilitators, and more. And I'm Emily Alice. I'm a sacred medicine practitioner, which includes a lot more than psychedelics, but those are central, and a Master of Divinity student here at Harvard. And I owe a great deal of the wisdom that I carry in this world, and more specifically the wisdom that brought me here to this conversation, to those underground groups. We know a lot about psychedelics in these communities, honey. From their potential to their limits, how they mix with other substances and experiences, how to quickly assess physiological states and wellness without special instruments, how to manage consent and intimacy, understanding the queering of roles that takes place in an altered consciousness space, navigating various risks, managing stigma, and so much more. The work and experiences of sex workers in particular brings a tremendous amount of insight to psychedelics. To use the words of an icon in the US sex worker movement, Hunter Light, sex workers via their erotic labor are facilitators of intense and criminalized altered states. Additionally, it is incredibly common that sex workers are engaged by clients to support them in their use of psychedelics and other consciousness-altering substances, sometimes in tandem with the altered state brought on by powerful erotic experience. Following and unsurprisingly, sex workers in all their various forms have been facilitators of psychedelic experiences beyond the contemporary West. There is evidence of this practice from thousands of years ago in Central America and South Asia. This is a lineage of knowledge that crosses across cultures, across class, across time, across indigenous and settler divides. It is important to state that sex workers are the facilitators of these experiences because many popular conceptions of the sex trade are misconceptions that assume a lack of agency on the part of the sex worker. The according skill sets, disposition, ethics, and worldview of sex workers, particularly those who administer psychedelics to clients, constitute a wealth of knowledges applicable to this conversation. One particularly notable knowledge that exists within the sex work community and in many other and overlapping corners of the underground is that of the ethic of harm reduction. Harm reduction looks different depending on set and setting, but what is most important is its political implication. It above all respects and seeks to preserve autonomy for people in all its forms, corporal, spiritual, cognitive, etc., while also supporting the harmonious function of community without the intervention of the state. Relatedly, the sex work community globally has long reached consensus on policy strategies for ensuring dignity and safety for both workers and clients in the erotic care workplace, perhaps the closest analog to the psychedelic care workplace. And that policy strategy is blanket decriminalization. And it has not been achieved in the majority of the world. These knowledges are incredibly valuable in terms of supporting people in the safe, generative, and potentially transcendent use of sacred medicines, as well as in terms of the potential for a few people from outside these communities to leverage them for their own financial or professional gain. And that is just part of what is at stake, and why having a decolonial, non-extractive, and liberatory approach to this conversation is paramount. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Osiris Inoue González Romero. I am glad to share this symposium with you. Currently, I am a postdoctoral fellow in psychedelics and spirituality here at the Center for the Study of World Religions, working on a project on indigenous medicine and psilocybin mushroom rituals in Mesoamerica. Regarding the workshops, my goal is to reflect a little bit on the narratives regarding nature in the psychedelic space, because it's very common. It's a common topic to argue that psychedelics enhance or are capable to transform the relationship between human beings and nature, right? This is one of the most interesting topics addressed in mass media and research papers. And if this is true at individual level, right, there is some ethical issues of concern regarding this topic that are not visible at the first glance. I have a background in philosophy, and my lens in this workshop is through ethics and transitional justice, religious freedom, freedom of religion, and cognitive liberty, but also my framework is from ethics of liberation, which is a secular branch of the theology of liberation. And with this framework in mind, for example, regarding responsibility, which is one of the core values, I am addressing some issues. There is a paradox, right, regarding the narratives of nature within psychedelic studies, because we are concerned, for example, regarding biomedicalization for sure, because it means the liberation for the mass consumption of psychedelics. And of course, the impacts in the ecosystems or in the economy will be huge. But on the other hand, for example, now we are experiencing the over-harvesting of peyote or the over-harvesting of ayahuasca due to the huge growth of different churches or spiritual movements who seeks to fill the spiritual needs of human beings. But for example, the Native American church in the United States grew up really huge in the last 20 years, and now there are 400,000 members of the Native American church with a demand of 2 million of peyote bottoms each year, right? And this high demand, it's putting too much pressure, for example, in the desert, in the Mexican desert, and even, for example, Mexican indigenous people ask for protection in order to avoid, for example, the selling of peyote to the indigenous peoples from the United States. So there is a conflict between indigenous peoples due to the over-harvesting of peyote, and due to its border, cross boundaries issue. There are different legal frameworks in both sides of the border, and due to it's not possible to address this issue properly. In the same case, for example, with ayahuasca, there are several concerns regarding, for example, in Iquitos and in Peru, with the boom of psychedelic tourism. And nowadays, for example, it's more difficult to find ayahuasca in some places near to Iquito, in some lakes that are very close to the city. For example, the rivers Sucalí, Marañón, and Napo. And now, for example, according to some data before the pandemic, for example, there were almost 70 retreat centers in Iquitos. Meanwhile, in 2016 were 30 centers. So in 2 or 3 years, the number of the centers increased, or grow twice. Right? So there are different phenomena. Also, for example, the Santo Daime or the União de Vegetal churches, for example, in Brazil, experience a huge growth in the last decade, and nowadays, for example, according to the census of 2010, and the census of 2020 is not too much accurate due to the pandemic and due to the fact that, for example, some people used to hide their religious affiliation regarding ayahuasca churches, and they uncover the religious affiliation, so the numbers usually are, lower. So nowadays, we are talking about almost 150,000 ayahuasca drinkers in Brazil. Only in Sao Paulo, there is a church with 7,000 people who each week attend the ceremonies to drink ayahuasca. So the question here is, we have to be aware of the overexploitation of the resources in order to avoid the reproduction of neocolonial mechanism, and to avoid this paradoxical situation between, these narratives that enhance the relationship or highlight, the relationship between human beings in nature, which is true, right? At individual or at looking at the indigenous worldviews, but perhaps, in order to satisfy these spiritual, philosophical, or therapeutic needs, right? We need to think twice regarding this over-harvesting and take responsibility in order to avoid the reproduction of neocolonial mechanism. And this is the thing that I want to highlight in this decolonial lens of psychedelics, especially regarding nature, because it's a very interesting topic regarding, for example, with climate change, global warming, and the loss of biodiversity. So in order to avoid the loss of biodiversity, this is an issue in which it's necessary to go deeper.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Lorian, Jeff, Ashwin, Emily, Osiris. Thank you all for sharing your insights with us this evening. It's such a delightful, rich conversation. It's leaving me a lot to mull over for the rest of the evening. And thanks to you all for your presence, your attention, your wonderful questions, and your support for this sort of project here. We're grateful to the Center's faculty director, Dr. Charles Stang, and our events coordinator, Lori Sedgwick, and to the rest of the CSWR staff for their support. We're also grateful for the support of the broader Harvard study of psychedelics in society and culture. And thank you to those participating online, of course. And as mentioned by Jeff earlier, our annual psychedelics conference, Psychedelic Intersections, is coming up next semester on February 15th, 2025. Can you believe it? You can register now for both in-person and live stream attendance, and in-person registration is limited, so we recommend you do so sooner than later. And with that, we will bid you all adieu for the evening. Thank you for your attention, your thoughtful questions, and we wish you a lovely rest of your evening.
Sponsor, Center for the Study of World Religions.
Copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of